There was a moment, sitting in a depressingly near-empty and silent cinema, watching Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, I was gripped by a tearful, bolshy sullenness that I thought astonishing in a grown man. The sequence was toward the end of the film. Phoebe Waller-Bridge races a motorcycle down a runway, pursuing a reconstructed World War II Heinkel bomber aircraft, then leaps aboard, intending to rescue an 80-year-old Indiana Jones, held captive by a former Nazi scientist and his goons, who were using a 2,000-year-old time-travel clockwork device invented by Greek mathematician Archimedes to travel their Heinkel bomber through a fissure in time, to alter history so that Germany wins World War II, but the calculations are off, and the airplane emerges in the skies above the siege of Syracuse in 214 BC, with the ancient warriors staring up at the bomber aircraft above them, from which the Nazi scientists' goons are shooting their pistols, while behind, a 13-year-old Moroccan street boy and friend of Phoebe Waller-Bridge's, with no practical flight experience at the controls of a light airplane, has followed the Heinkel bomber through the rift, and then the Heinkel bomber crashes and the Nazi scientist dies, and Indiana Jones and Phoebe Waller-Bridge encounter ancient Greek Archimedes himself, who stoops to take the wristwatch off the dead Nazi, and then have a conversation with the two people who are from 2,000 years in the future. And then Indiana Jones decides he wants to stay in this timeline, despite the protestations of Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who then forces the issue by punching beloved cinematic icon Indiana Jones in the face, knocking him unconscious, and then Indy wakes up back in 1969. Having watched this film, I could understand how, at the premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, much of the audience grew so bored that they began to mumble among themselves in French. Ah bien attraper ton futur et ton faire passer carnaval tout faire pour celui-là. In an opening sequence, a de-aged Indy and his friend Basil are in pursuit of an artifact from the Nazis in the dying days of World War II. The partial Dial of Destiny they find, designed by Greek mathematician Archimedes, will torment Basil for years with what he believes is its power to open up fissures in time. Fast forward to the present day of the film, 1969. Indiana Jones is a cranky old bachelor who, on his last day as a professor, is visited by Phoebe Waller-Bridge's Helena Shaw, Basil's daughter and Indy's goddaughter, who tries to entice him to help her track down the second part of the Dial. Only Helena isn't entirely what she seems. As far from being an earnest and idealistic budding archaeologist, she is in fact a callous opportunist who only wants to procure artifacts for profit. When a Nazi scientist from the earlier World War II sequence, his gang having tracked down Helena, converges upon her and Indy, a pursuit around the globe follows, for 2.5 hours. Indiana Jones's old character trait of comical duress, of anxious befuddlement after a punch lands ineffectually on a muscle-bound lackey, or his infiltration of a place full of bad guys goes awry, his thin disguise is seen through and he scuttles away, or his expression when some sort of courageous antic falls through, a hallmark of the series, feels overused and played out in this final film. The biggest problem with the film is Phoebe Waller-Bridge. The initial conceit of her character is sort of interesting, but her presence on screen is so disproportionately in the way that it feels a relief every time we just have Indiana Jones on the screen. Her persona of pert sassiness, constantly facetious, constantly snatching agency and the thread of a conversation away from Indy, constantly imposing herself in situations, the constant reiterations during action, and even in her own dialogue that she is smart, resourceful, and independent, becomes so jarring it is genuinely frustrating. People aren't paying to see her. She isn't as appealing as Indy. She doesn't work as a co-lead. At some moments, at a subliminal level, she feels like an antagonist in the film, more so than the flat, generic, actual adversary. Karen Allen as Marion Ravenwood was a strong female character who, bear with me here, wasn't a sanctimonious pain in the ass with no charisma and disproportionately foregrounded. Kate Capshaw as Willie Scott, bear with me here again, didn't especially know how to fight, shoot guns, sling wilting one-liners, and didn't especially know how to cope in a wild environment, and yet could still be an appealing character whose fish-out-of-water characterization, a classy dame in a treacherous underworld, actually provided an amusing and wry counterpoint to Indy. The de-aging technology in the opening World War II sequence almost works, but there are 3 or 4 instances when Harrison Ford's face seems as stiltedly off as the computer resurrected Grand Moff Tarkin. The problem with this software is that it's kind of an all-or-nothing proposition now. Once the illusion falters for a moment, your connection and suspense of disbelief withdraws and goes into neutral. There are too many ticked-off indie tropes from the other films. We see Indiana Jones delivering a lecture, which clumsily evokes the class scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Except now the students, once reverential towards him, are detached and bored. A bag containing a half of the Dial of Destiny is tossed around during a melee, clumsily evoking, or plainly ripping off, the tumbling and skidding vial of a cure for the poison Indy is given in Temple of Doom. There is a new short round in the form of a Moroccan street boy named Teddy. There are huge eels around a shipwreck substituting for Indy's old fare of snakes, huge bugs in a cave reprising the same scene from Temple of Doom, and of course there is a new Belloc taking artifacts away from Indy. The drawn-out nonsense of a chase amid a street parade is genuinely dispiriting to watch. Just a visual mess of ridiculous action, including a horse ride through the subway. There are constantly recurring, ever more ludicrously contrived convergences of the different groups of characters at exactly the most dramatic moment. In a storage office, at sea, outside ruins, inside ruins, at an airplane hangar. Really getting to the heart of why this film doesn't work involves asking, what are the missing elements that were the basis of Indiana Jones's appeal? One is old-world exoticism. There is a span between the First and Second World Wars, imbued with a romantic colonial atmosphere in places such as Cairo, Shanghai, or India. The appeal is in the mixture of a colonial presence, with its pith helmets and fez hats, buildings with European facades and glass and wrought iron canopies and whirring fans, and local tribes and customs, and the juxtaposition of a sleek modernity. Rickshaws intermingled with the elegant curved chassis of Buicks, curses and poisoned darts from spears intermingled with revolvers and machine guns. Horse and camelback riding intermingled with the smoky drone of seaplanes, cargo aircraft and submarines. Local people in practical garb, Europeans in white linen, and the severe, black, menacing elegance of Nazi uniforms. A key caveat here, in this grimly revisionist, wrist-slapping modern culture, is that Spielberg and Lucas weren't trying to recreate or sugarcoat or laud that period. Theirs was a romantic reimagining, a sentimental pastiche seen through the gaudy lens of their memories of the serials of their youth. There is therefore a built-in irony that is enough to ward off the buzzkill op-ed writers of The Guardian. Indiana Jones, as an archaeologist and as an American, was the perfect protagonist to let loose amongst all of this. A Westerner with the means to move with facility between places in the Western social and cultural milieu in that exotic world, but also an outsider, subject to the whims and dangers and double crosses of others' interests. Another intrinsic element to Indiana Jones is horror. While in many ways a whimsical adventure franchise, Spielberg and Lucas were not shy about adding horror elements, which had the effect of grounding and balancing the films, so that instead of lapsing into too much benign fun with slapstick elements and gravity-defying chases, there would be elements of dread and visceral body horror. Viewers winced and squirmed when the little bespectacled Nazi picks up the scalding hot golden amulet and it singes and melts the flesh of his hand. A generation of kids were mortified by the spectacle of melting faces at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and by a tribal elder reaching into a strung-up sacrificial victim's chest and removing his heart, which he flourished to the gathered acolytes. There is nothing like that in Dial of Destiny. This would enhance another crucial element, the special allure right at the heart of Indiana Jones: mysticism. Where Kingdom of the Crystal Skull went wrong, and Dial of Destiny has gone wrong again, is in failing to utilize the spiritual elements' symbolic functions, in particular adding a moral core to the films. Those who were corrupt of heart would be killed by the spirits that arise from the Ark of the Covenant. Only those worthy and humble would choose the right ancient cup to drink from in the Last Crusade. As a viewer, especially as a kid, you latently explore your own sense of whether you would measure up. What fate might befall you if the spirits from the Ark beheld you. Another key element of Indiana Jones is time, more specifically, brevity. Raiders of the Lost Ark clocked in at a brisk 2 hours, though it is packed with so many innovations, so many likable characters, so much world building, so much charm, and so much narrative economy that it feels like an epic story. The Dial of Destiny is half an hour longer than Raiders and drags horribly. Another key element is supporting characters. Denham Elliott with his wistful, toffish Britishness as Dr. Marcus Brody, Paul Freeman as the effete and snide René Belloc, Ronald Lacey as the campishly villainous Major Arnold Todt, John Rhys-Davies as the Brian Blessedish Salah, Ke Huy Quan as Short Round, and of course Sean Connery were all perfect. Nothing wrong with Mads Mikkelsen, but you also have Mads Mikkelsen just playing the most generic type of Mads Mikkelsen. You know exactly what you're going to get. You almost feel that you could write the character yourself. Lastly, a key element in Indiana Jones is, of course, Steven Spielberg. And we're talking peak Spielberg here. The fact that he was writing E.T. at the same time he was shooting Raiders of the Lost Ark says everything about this period in his career. James Mangold is fine, but he's no Spielberg, and what comes across on screen is a poor pastiche of Indiana Jones by the numbers, ticking off all the tropes, in a bland effort at something that was once a perfectly distilled expression of what movie making can be.